David Mercer is a former ordained United Methodist pastor. And we still had this many people show up. Before, it's a Methodist, it's okay. So before transferring to the United Methodist, he was a minister for the Churches of Christ and independent Christian churches. So you can see he slowly kind of slid, it seems like. He was a minister for 35 years in Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Wow, that must have been hard. Additionally, he was an adjunct professor at Southeastern Oklahoma State University. He's got a Bachelor of Science degree from Abilene Christian University and a Master of Divinity from Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. As a member of the Clergy Project, which you've heard us talk about before, and I hope David talks about today. If not, we'll pick it up in questions. It's an association of religious professionals who no longer hold supernatural beliefs. So it's clergy and former clergy who are kind of on the way out of that belief spectrum. David writes occasionally for the blog Rational Doubt by Linda Lascola, one of the founders and supporters of the Clergy Project. Until recently, he used the pen name Stan Bennett, and I guess recently is becoming farther in the past. The name he used for the CNN documentary, Atheists Inside the World of Non-Believers, and the Canadian documentary, Losing Our Religion. David finally escaped from behind the pulpit and is now completely out of the closet as an atheist. He lives in Orlando, where he's married to his wife Sylvia, who we've seen all the time. When we see David, we see Sylvia. He is also a host of our Freethought Cafe in the southern part of the county, northern Osceola. He's a host of that. He's a writer, a storyteller, a substitute teacher for Orange County, and a life coach. And you can find more on him at damercerlife.com. And I'm sure he'll plug that life coaching that he just started doing, and hopefully some of you will take advantage of that. So if you all would help me welcome David Mercer.
I always used to say, I'm glad to see you, but I have to look at you first to make sure that's true. And yes, I'm glad to see you. I appreciate getting to meet you this way. I do feel, I've been in front of audiences most of my adult life, and I have this feeling that washes over me. It's been a while since I've been a minister, and I have this feeling it's just washing over me as I stand in front of you, and I'm trying to identify it. I know what it is. I'd like to take up an offering. If you Okay, y'all are easy. That's good. I didn't know what kind of an audience you would be. One of the anxieties I really did have is that when you're a minister, make sure I'm standing in the right place here. When you're a minister, you get cut a lot of slack when you stand up in the pulpit. You say things with a certain amount of authority, put a little gravitas in your voice, and if you give this intense stare, this is because I can't see very well. Instead of squinting, I do this stare. You know? Okay? And if I really want to get intense, I might pick somebody and point at them. I know you, Helen, so I'm pointing at you. And I might do some of this intense look like that. And folks come to church, and even if they're reasonable, rational people, and many of the people I preach for are, but there is a slight superstition that runs through religion that allows me the opportunity as a minister to just say, well, whatever the hell I want to, and if I can back it up and say it loud enough, there's going to be a few people going out there going, yeah, that's right. But see, I come Methodist. Some people say amen. In the Methodist church, they go, mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'm a little, you know, as I was getting ready for this, I was kind of afraid because I thought, okay, these people aren't going to cut me any slack. I'm used to getting up and having pretty free reign when I speak, and I think this is going to be interesting, and it's okay if you don't want to cut me any slack. And during the question session, if you decide you want to challenge me or something like that, I'll just fall to the floor and crumble and be hysterical or something like that. It's something mature like that, but it is a little intimidating to work with and speak with intelligent people, but it's also an honor. Now don't laugh so loud. I was just, you know, I was trying to pay you a compliment. Now, anyway. I was a minister for 35 years, and for the last 3 or 4 of them, I didn't believe in God anymore. But the truth of the matter is, I had been dealing with that cognitive dissonance for a very long time. And I can go back about 20 years and recognize some of that happening to me. even then. In fact, as I thought about that, I thought, man, I can go back to childhood and remember some of the questions and the doubts that I had. And then people like my dad, who is a minister, and the people I grew up with, they would say helpful things like, "Oh, I don't even allow myself to think those kinds of things, David." And that was a scolding. And you say, "Oh, okay, let's not think about it." And that's one of those little strategies we had for the cognitive dissonance. I'll tell you about that in just a minute, but I remember when I got very sick about 20 years ago. I had diabetes. I had a depressive episode. I landed in the hospital for several days, and then I got out, and it took about a year to start recovering from all of that. And I remember the church I was working for at the time said, "You obviously need a little time off. Why don't you go and refresh?" And so I went to one of those preacher retreats, one of those preacher gatherings, and it was kind of fun. Most of them are dull, but it was kind of fun, and most of them had some great music. Now, I grew up I was a Methodist, and I grew up in Church of Christ, and we were the non-charismatic folks, and we sang 4-part harmony without the piano, and mostly it was dull. You know, I'm sorry, it was. And when I got to this place, they had guitars and they had drums, and all the guys were singing out loud, and we were clapping and swaying back and forth, and there were 2 or 3 of the old people at that time going. So I knew it was going to be great, you know. And I thought, okay, this is more like it. I like this. And then suddenly I'm hit with a wave of dizziness. I get literally dizzy and confused. And I'd been standing up, and I fell back in my chair. And I still don't know what that was about. Except that it was everything I was thinking I wanted. And then I still had the doubts. And it still had an unreal quality to it. And that's how the cognitive dissonance hit me the worst. I remember not long after that, I was sitting on my porch on a Sunday morning, and it just hit me. I don't believe any of this. And I've got to go preach in 30 minutes. And I called my brother and told him, and we talked it over, and I called my best friend, and we talked it over. And I remember just kind of pulling myself together and going what I'd prepared to say, and giving what I'd prepared to say. And I went home, and my best friend drove a couple hours to come see me. We went for a walk, and he's a good Baptist guy, and he was trying to talk me through it and trying to lead me to the other side, back into the way of the truth and such. And I blew up at him, and I said, "Craig, you're an intellectual. You're a PhD. And I know that you have a problem with some of this. And what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I decide that I'm going to believe. I just made the decision that that's what I'm going to do." Well, Craig was very influential to me. He was my best friend. He did I could tell you stories about the good things he did for me. And is the smartest man I know. So I tried to take his advice. You know how they tell couples who are at odds with each other, you say, "Okay, I know you don't feel loving towards each other, but why don't you just act loving towards each other, and maybe you'll act your way into feeling that way?" Well, that's what I did for myself. I thought, I'm having trouble believing. I'll act like I believe, and hopefully the belief will come back. And I did that. In fact, I doubled down and decided I'd not only that, I'd stay a minister, but I'd go back to school and get my seminary degree, and I would become a Methodist, which seemed so much more progressive to me at the time, and it was. And I did all of that. 20 years later, my children are almost grown and almost out of the house. And I'm back right where I was. I don't believe this anymore. And this time I didn't fight it. And this time I just sort of gave up and said, this is it. I don't. I just don't buy it anymore. And I could tell you why, but you already know. Some of you probably make those arguments really, really well. And the fact is, I don't articulate them very well. Many of you are much better at that than I am. I'm not really interested in getting up and arguing about what I don't believe. I'm a little tired of that anyway. I don't want to come up with the 5 reasons why I don't believe in God. I think you come up with 5 reasons why you do believe, and then we'll discuss that. Amen. The offering basket probably is back again. Oh, we got one. We really do have one. Well, even atheists have to eat, don't we? And you know, occasionally someone will say, very gently these days, they're not real, you know, they're not real combative with me. But they will ask me and say, well, what brought you to this point? And why are you at this point now? And I said, after all of this time, 35 years, the case has just not been made to me. I tried to make it. I preached it. I did the very best I could. I defended God. I defended the Bible. I know it. Don't try to argue with me about it, by the way. But the case just isn't made. It just falls apart, and that's why. Did I read a lot about it? Truthfully, no. Did I do lots of research about atheism? Not really. I just gave up. That's a long time to struggle. And you know how I feel about looking back over 35 years of doing something that I mostly didn't believe, and it took me 31 years to finally own up that I just didn't believe it. Do you know how I feel? You want me to tell you how I feel, Phil? Stupid. And none of you laughed at that. That's good. I appreciate that. I just think, why did I do that? Why? Why did I do that? Why did I work so hard to make that work? Well, in fact, someone asked me a question. He might be here. I'm not sure if he is. I can't see him. He asked me not too long ago. He said, why don't Christians just kind of wake up and say, you know, this doesn't make any sense? Rationally. Why don't they just say, you know, this just doesn't hold up? And this is, I know there are some of you who are believers, and my apologies if I speak and I offend you. It's not my intention to. And, you know, if we need to talk later on and patch things up, okay. Because, because I don't want to be enemies. It's not really, I want to have a collaboration and work with folks and have a way of being able to persuade and make my case known. I can't do that if I piss people off constantly. I did enough of that when I was a Christian with them. And somebody said, why is that so hard? And I said, speaking as one, I said, well, it's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's really not one at all. I mean, you use your intellect to do your studying and to do some of your reasoning and some of your rationalizations on that and to come to your conclusions. You do use that, but it is not basically a rational thing. And so the person leaped ahead and said, oh, okay, you're saying it's emotional. Well, now there's emotion there too. There's a lot of deep depth of feeling in religious experience. It's a very intense thing, but that's not what kept me in, and that's not what keeps most people in. I'll tell you what it is. I grew up the child of a preacher, and my whole community was church. Everybody who loved me was the church. Everybody who thought well of me was the church. Everybody that gave me support was the church. Everybody that said kind and good things to me. Everybody that did anything that counted for me was in the church. The people that held me when I was a baby were in the church. The woman that taught me to count was at church, and she showed me in the hymnal. I learned the secret code about moving to the next column when you got to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You go to double digits and you have another column, and then you go all the way up to that again and you go to another column. Well, it's code, right? Broke the code. And Helen Luker taught me that while I sat with her at church, and she gave me gum. I learned to sing in church. I learned to read music in church. I learned to sing a cappella in church. And I became a musician in church. And I played the guitar because I had some musical ability. And then I was able to perform because of the church. And then I moved out of the Churches of Christ where they could actually let you, enjoy the music too and do other things. And I got to do, I learned music in church. And for me to say, no, I don't believe that anymore. Well, I am cutting strings with my mother and my father and my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles and everybody I ever knew. And because I was a minister, because I was educated in the ways of the church and in the ways of theology, all of my everything I did for a living had to do with the church. And when I started looking around for other work, I wasn't qualified for anything else. I have a master's degree, and it's a huge one, about 85 graduate hours. It's a big degree, and it's not worth very much outside of the church. It's not worth a lot. So all of that goes through me when I think, I'm not sure I believe this, but what am I going to do? I have 2 children. I have a wife that doesn't work. I have to be able to provide. And I won't know anybody. Everybody that I know will be mad at me and hurt with me. And they'll start talking about me as if I were dead. Mm-hmm. So I pretended a bit. I rationalized a bit. I tried to make myself believe for a bit. And the last 4 years, I thought, okay, whatever it takes, I'm getting out, but I'm going to take my time. I joined the Clergy Project. I called on a friend of mine, Daniel Finca, who is a prominent atheist philosopher, and he writes the blog Camels with Hammers. Anybody familiar with that? Yeah, several of you are. He and I debated back and forth in earlier years, and he was the guy I called first, or I texted with him. He said, Clergy Project, named some other names, and put me in touch. I started reading the book Caught in the Pulpit by Linda Lascola and Daniel Dennett. I did read that one. And as I read it, my hands shook. I thought, this is me. And I emailed Linda Lascola. And she made sure I was in the Clergy Project, where there were other ministers who no longer believed. I think there are about 700 of them now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. Surprised her so much she dropped her phone. And they helped me start looking for work, and they encouraged me. They set up that interview with CNN, and they interviewed me as the minister who no longer believes. And they put me in shadow, and they distorted my voice. I sound just like Darth Vader. And I wrote some anonymously to Stan. And every Sunday I would get up, and sometimes I couldn't look at my audience anymore. I'd look down like this. And then I realized that's what I'm doing, so I looked up again. And then I got real careful about what I said and started phrasing things differently. Things like, if you believe that Jesus is Lord, then you might want to consider this idea. See how I said that? It's clever, huh? And I said, I put it like that, and I became less effective as a minister. Although, to tell you the truth, I never packed them in, and I never had those mass, those mass where people come forward and half the congregation stands up at the end and they all come forward and they're crying and everything. I never had that. I used to feel a little embarrassed about that, but now I'm proud because I didn't like manipulating people. And so I was never at the top echelon. I was respected, but never at the top, and not ever going to be one of the stars, and that's okay. And I left it alone for about 3 years. And then my sons were grown. My younger one was about to move out and to go to college. And I'd already told him first, that I didn't believe. And then I told my wife, and then I told my older son. And then I sat down with my wife and said, we've been unhappy a long time. And I suggested that we release each other from the marriage. And she opposed it a bit, but not much, because I was right. And she agreed. And the boys were already going to be out of the house, and later we told the church. And the church I was working with surprised me at how kind they were to me. And several of them said, could you please stay? Please don't leave. And so initially I agreed, but I was still looking. The boys were gone. My wife was gone. And I still didn't know what I was going to do. I figured I was just going to have to hang on till retirement. That's what a lot of clergy project members have to do. And we have each other to talk. But I'm a member of another community online, and I have permission to mention it. I'm a member of the Lasting Supper, and it's run by a guy named David Hayward, who calls himself the Naked Pastor. Okay, it's not a porn site. It's not one of those things. He means naked as in vulnerable. And he used to be a minister for some churches. He doesn't preach anymore. His beliefs he's outgrown where he's been. And now he runs a little community among others. He's an artist and he's a writer. And he runs a little online community of supporters of about 200 people. And we're all up and down the spectrum of people coming to a different place in their spiritual awareness. And when I said, he was one of the first ones, I said, David, I've decided I'm an atheist. He said, are you sure? I said, yeah. And he said, good. Congratulations. I don't know what he is, to tell you the truth. And we talked to each other a lot, and I told them that I was having a hard time, and I told them that my marriage was crumbling and had been for a good long time. And I remember one particular time I said, I'm lonesome, and I've been lonesome all of my life. I'm this public person, and I'm lonesome all of my life, and I'm not doing this anymore. And I'm going to start seeing people. Now that I'm separated, I'm going to start seeing people. I'm done with being by myself. And of course, you can't when you're the minister, and it's hard. Everybody's paying attention to you. I decided I would be dating people from out of town. And I said, I'm going to find people, I'm going to date them out of town. And that's when someone from online got in touch with me. And she said, why don't you come to Florida and visit me? And I thought,
needed a vacation.
I did. Her name was Sylvia. So I made plans to do that. And we liked each other. Like a lot. Like right off the bat.
Right away.
Like right away. Didn't even get out of the airport, as I recall. Before we noticed that we liked each other. We're married now. And because we got married, and Sylvia is well established here, I could quit. And so my advice is, if you're in a profession and you need to get out because you're a minister and you're not qualified for anything else, marry up. And so I did, and I moved here, and all of this happened fairly quickly. Oh, my church was really mad at me for leaving. We're being videoed, right? Okay, never mind. I was going to tell you. I will tell you this. I had one woman who was really mad at me for leaving. And she said, well, you could have stayed. You could have stayed. And I hadn't told anybody about my beliefs at that moment. She said, we'd have found you a woman. I thought, okay. I'm going to get a church committee to find me some companionship. That's something I'm going to do. That's the way I'm going to make that work. I want a church committee to decide who I'm going to date. Yeah, no, thanks. Thank you anyway. I appreciate that, but no, thank you. It happened very quickly. I found Sylvia, and I just said, I'm moving away. I quit. I've had it. And they said, okay. What are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I'm going to write some. How are you going to live? I'll manage. And then a few months later, weeks, I put it out that you and I were seeing each other. And then we got married at the first of the year. I'm starting over again. I resisted the term life coach for a long time because it just sounded like another word for unemployed to me. But the truth is, and it's my apologies to those of you who are life coaches, by the way. I'm one of you now. And I understand that you work very hard. It is what I do. I like taking care of people. I like helping people. I just couldn't buy the party line while I was doing it. And I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. I haven't watched the time. How much time do we have? And did anybody want to ask or say anything?
I have one question.
Okay. This lady had her hand up here.
Okay.
And
You're next.
And then you're next, sir. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not clear on what you told this church when once you decided you didn't believe anymore and you wanted to leave. You still didn't tell them you no longer believe?
That's correct. I did not.
So they never knew
I just stonewalled them. Well, I started a blog called Deep Calls, and I did explain the process of which, explaining why I didn't believe anymore. And that's when they first found out about it, was through my blog. I wrote them through Facebook and said, I'm writing this blog, this will explain some things to you. And that's when they first found out about it. Thank you, that's a good question. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, David, just curious to know, after 35 years, I hope you were blessed with a pension.
Some.
Some, okay.
Yes, sir. The Methodist Church takes care of its pastors pretty well. I came in about halfway through my career. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is John Gaffney.
Hi, John.
Actually, I was a Roman Catholic priest for 10 years, Franciscan, ordained in 1962.
You and I need to go have some coffee, man.
And I'll tell you, when I left, I had devout poverty. I left with one suitcase at age 36.
I packed up my car, and that was it.
Yeah, but I have I was a missionary. I lived in a monastery 15 years, and was a missionary in Bolivia and Chile. And I right now, I don't believe in anything supernatural. And maybe some I'd be interested in coming back. I have a different story than yours. I will say one thing. I hate to call myself an atheist, because I hate to define myself by what I'm not. Put A in front of any word, and it means not.
Same
It's like
here.
someone said, political, what are you? Well, not a Republican. What does that mean? I'm a religious naturalist, and it's always a conversation piece. Say atheist, it closes the door.
I'm reluctant to use, is this losing its juice or something? I'm reluctant to use the word atheist for the same reason.
Yeah. Even agnostic, it's the same thing.
Same thing.
Don't put that A in front of
We'll
a
turn
word.
it up. You can keep using it. We'll turn it up.
All right. For the same reason, and I used agnostic for a while just to kind of soften the blow for folks, but I've decided, it is what it is. I'll use the word, but it does close doors, and so sometimes I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word. It's true. It makes me think. Recently, a fellow substitute teacher, they were asking me questions, and they found out I'd been a minister. And they said, I'm a minister too. I said, well, that's great. I don't believe anymore, but that's okay. It's okay. I don't really want to fight, so let's not do that. And they didn't fight. They just witnessed to me. Told me all that God had done for them for it seemed like hours, like to wear me out. And it made me feel really, really bad about all the time I made people sit through and listen to me.
So you're not a hypocrite anymore.
No. Well, not about that, anyway.
Yeah, hi. Now, you got divorced around the time that you left the church.
Yes.
Um,
Beforehand, actually, a little
yeah, a little beforehand, right. But I don't want to get too personal, but were there other issues, or was it simply the matter of religion?
Yeah, thank you for the not wanting to get too personal. I get what you're going on that, and I won't air. I have never aired the dirty laundry of my previous marriage. But, of course, there were other issues. And it would be a mistake for me to blame the church for the marital issues that I was dealing with. In fact, as a ministerial counselor and as someone who talks with folks, when anybody says to me, my spouse is going to leave me because I believe in God, I always know that's bogus. That's always bogus. And sometimes that's what is believed. But usually there are other issues as well too. But the guy I was thinking about who said that was several years ago, and I was still a minister at the time. And I thought, I know your wife's got some other complaints about you, Bob. Oh, yes, ma'am. I didn't see you here.
I don't know exactly how to ask this question. but
Louder.
Yeah, ask it louder.
I was very young. I recognized, and I didn't even know what these words meant at the time, but I recognized a fiscal imperative in church. And no one ever talked to me about that, why the money was such a big part of church. Could you speak on that?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a driving force to raise money and to keep that going? And I
Sure.
know that like the knockoff churches, they don't have to kick it upstairs like a
Yeah. They're not top down. Yeah.
right.
There's several pieces to that question. In fact, the non-denominational churches and Pentecostal churches, as I recall. This is Sylvia, by the way, if you didn't figure that out. The pastor handles the money, and counts the money and puts the pressure on the people, and he yes, he has that he has all of that, and yes, there are financial goals they set, or financial goals they have to pay for, and so yes, there is that urgency that they use, and urgency seems like a very sweet word compared to what they do. I mean, they really put the arm on people sometimes to bring the money coming in.
So it's not just my imagination.
Oh no, honey. No, and they some are rough at it, and y'all have experiences with that if you've been in church. Sometimes they're really rough. I will say, to defend myself, I never, almost never, spoke about the finances. I never touched the money. I never counted the money. For the longest time, I didn't keep up with who gave what. I finally decided that was probably important. If any other nonprofit agency, that would be an important thing for the head to know. But I didn't. I tried not to. I tried to watch that so I wouldn't show favoritism for it. I finally did a little. Started doing things a little differently. If they forced me to preach a sermon on giving, I made it fairly theoretical, and I never pressed people. I was terrible at it. I will say we always paid our bills. I will say a couple of times when the churches were running low, and churches are always close to broke. They have money coming in, but they have bills to pay, which is why they have the imperative. And usually I would write a letter or put something in the newsletter and say, we're running a little short. If you have some extra, we sure would appreciate it. And that's all I ever had to do. Now, okay, that's different from what you've heard before, and I'm sorry that you might have felt that urgency before. It always hit the ones that struggled the most and who were the most conscientious, and I was always careful about that. Now, the reason there's so much problem with the money is that they're building these stupid buildings all the time. That's the most common thing, is they're building these huge buildings that are already half full, only half full, and they have the huge mortgages, and of course they're just bleeding everybody dry to pay for a building they didn't need in the first place.
Like the I-4?
Well, you'd have to, I don't know the area as much as I do, and several of you are going, yeah, because you're thinking, my wife here is too. Lots of churches have gone bankrupt by overbuilding, and
build it and they will come.
Build it, yeah. They would often quote that, build it and they will come. I said, folks, and I used to fight all the time. I'd say, folks, I promise you, you build a huge monstrosity, they're not going to come because they don't want to pay for it. Churches are vital and they grow if they're intense still, but they don't do really well when you build the Taj Mahals. Sorry. Except now I'm fighting the wrong crowd on that one. But anyway.
Okay. You're third.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hello. Can you describe what it felt for you or what it meant to you to lose your faith and belief, or if you thought that you ever had it?
Yeah. Relief. Relief. Now I didn't know that I would feel that, but to let go of that was causing me so much conflict in here was immediate relief. I don't know that everybody would say that, but that is true. Now the question I had is, what was I going to feel the first time I had a loss? See, my mom died back at Christmas time, and I knew it was coming because she'd been sick for a long time, and everything I ever preached about at funerals, heaven and the house with the room prepared for us and the streets of gold and the crystal sea and the great reunion and all of that, and we're going to get to see each other again and it'll all be wonderful. And well, I don't believe that anymore. And I wondered how that was going to affect me when I lost someone. And I was okay. I think I was okay because I loved my mom and she loved me. And she left me many gifts that I carry here and here. And there are many parts of my identity that came directly from her. And I have a great deal of her writing. And so all of that is with me. And all of that is still something that gives me some benefit. And I'm okay. When I die, and that was one of the questions, the interviewer on CNN that didn't make it into the interview part, but the first thing she hit me with is, what's going to happen to you when you die? And I said, oddly enough, I hadn't thought about that. What's going to happen to me? Well, this thing is, this body is wearing out even as we speak. And if the world can get a little good out of it, that'd be just great. And I'm going to try to do the best I can to be of benefit to the people around me while I can. But the truth of the matter is, when I fade out after all the years of struggle I've had, I'm glad to have some happiness these days. But when it's my turn to go, I think I'm going to be okay with that. Sorry, I answered more than you asked. Well, I felt like I needed to. I gave you one word, and I thought, I probably ought to go a little more than that.
Well, yeah, I was kind of hoping you would just, describe what it meant to feel faith and then to lose that belief in faith.
Well,
if you ever felt it at all.
Well, see, I've often questioned, did I believe? Did I not believe? And to not have to struggle with all of that was a relief to me. Yeah. Who else was? Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Ben Robles.
Hi, Ben.
Sandy's fiance.
Hi, Sandy. I know you from Facebook. I thought that was you. Congratulations, Joe.
Oh, thank you. September. Good. My question goes actually to enforce her question.
Yeah.
Have you ever met any other pastors that abuse the system?
No, not kidding. No.
They're wearing Gucci suits and driving Bentleys and private planes.
You're still on video.
Oh,
okay.
Have you ever encountered them?
Sure. Well, okay.
How did he take advantage of the system?
The televangelists out there, the ones that are asking for jet planes and things like that, that's very embarrassing. And most of the ministers I know are embarrassed about that. Most of the Methodist ministers I know are like me. They're just kind of embarrassed to death to ask for money. In fact, they give us seminars on how to do it, and we all hate it. We all go out and play golf or something during the seminar because we hate the thing and we don't want to do it. So we're a little bit like that, but and a lot of the ministers that get up and screech and holler about it are doing it from a sense of fear and urgency because they know they got bills to pay. What I noticed, in my system, was there was not a lot of accountability for a while as far as where the money was going and how it was being spent. And there have been many occasions where money was embezzled. Often not by the preacher in my circles, but it could be, and I've known of other churches where the money was embezzled, sometimes by the person that was counting the money all by themselves. And then you had an issue. Well, we finally got smarter and we do a little bit better, but a lot of churches, nobody's paying attention. And there's a lot of stealing that goes on. Is that answer your question on that? Yeah.
I could say we'd be asking for money a lot more if we had to pay an employee, so you guys are lucky.
I know that there was Charles Spurgeon. He was a Christian,
yeah.
And there's Dr. James White.
Okay.
Some people are familiar with him. Dr. James White wrote a book called Pulpit Crimes, which goes to
Pulpit Crimes.
Pulpit Crimes.
I'm not familiar with it.
He's a Reformed Baptist scholar. He has a doctorate in theology, and I just wanted to mention that book because he really rails on some of the issues he brought up. One thing I would like to ask is, besides embezzlement and things like that, which I've seen happen,
sure,
because just my background, I've seen it. Are there any other pulpit crimes that you've witnessed that you're kind of concerned about?
That I've witnessed?
That you're kind of concerned about?
I can tell you my concerns.
Yeah.
One of them, I'll use the anecdote to describe it. My Pentecostal minister friends, some of them are very conscientious, but a lot of them use their power to manipulate people, somewhat brutally in my opinion. I had a friend that came to his church, came to a minister's church, and she was in a vulnerable place, and she was looking for something, anything to help her get through, the days that were so hard. And so she came and she sat in an audience, and the minister got up, and I can do this. I can do this. I can say something like this. He'd say, "There's someone here today." You get real close to mine. "There's someone here today that the Lord wishes to speak to. There's someone here today, the Holy Spirit has been knocking on the door of their hearts in order to convey a message from the Lord. That person needs to open their heart." And he looks around the audience. "Well, there's my friend there," and she's going. and he sees it. And he starts looking at her in the audience. "Are you that person? Is God speaking to you today?" And and he starts creeping up, and he creeps up. Creep being a key word here. He mashes her head. She falls to the ground. She comes back to me, Pastor David, I just had the most wonderful experience, spiritually. I said, "Well, isn't that great?" And I wanted to go lay holy hands on the guy because he did that for the show. I can do that in any audience, maybe not this one. It's not hard to do. Those of you who have any attention in public speaking. Okay, I see one. He's busy going. I will say the woman who did it looked a lot prettier than me, going with the bobbing up and down thing. It's not hard to do if you know anything about speaking to an audience. You look through. Well, there are people who are vulnerable today. And the fact of them, and there are people that are vulnerable in every church service I was ever at. And the moment I noticed it, and I do, the moment I noticed it, you back up. You don't bore in, you back up because that person is fragile. And that's a crime when you don't. That's a crime.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I've seen a lot of, just to make sure that everyone knows that, people like Dr. James White is very concerned about that. Dr. Daniel B. Wallace is really concerned about that. There are other people really concerned about that. One of the biggest things I would also like to ask is, how could we, because I know most pastors are pretty good. What would be an appropriate way of exposing the pastors that are doing that kind of stuff, in your opinion?
I don't know, because this stuff is systemic. By the way, this is also why you have so many scandals, like sex scandals and things like that, because you got vulnerable people and overbearing people, and you got everything really, you got a very charged atmosphere. And because there's so much of everything that has a dishonest, unreal feeling to it, then you have lots of things like scandals that happen. Now, how do you deal with that? See, that's very frustrating to me. Very frustrating to me. I watched a video of this pastor that went crazy on his church. And I mean, he just pulled them out by name and started telling on them to everybody else. And he was, he was yelling and, and he talked to one young man bigger than me, made him stand up. He said, "I'm supposed to do your wedding." He said, "But you ain't been to church." He said, "You ain't worth 15 cents. This isn't church. Coat and tie. "You ain't worth 15 cents. What makes you think I'm going to do your wedding?" And he said, "Now stand up here." And then he says, "Give me a hug." I'm not kidding. Okay, here's the part I don't get. The young man stands up. And he hugs the asshole. And thanks him. I thought, well, somebody said for what? Someone said guilt. I heard that a moment ago. Yeah, there is guilt there, but there's this kind of desire, I think, to be controlled. by someone. And there's this abusive quality of, I'm being abused and I must deserve it. There's that quality happening there too. And every time I see it, I thought, boy, you better be glad I wasn't in that audience. Because I was raised to take care of the sheep. Sorry, that's an insulting term. But I know there are vulnerable people there. And you don't beat them up. I'd have beat him up. I've been there. But more than that, I wanted to stand up to answer the question. I wanted to stand up. I would have shouted him down. And I would have stood up and said, why are you people listening to him? See, that's what I don't get. Grown people letting themselves be beat up. How can we keep that from happening? Why is it happening in the first place? I don't know. I mean, I've got some theories about psychosis and pathology and group dynamics and things like that. And there are some people that are much smarter than me about those type of things. But the fact is, we need to deal with that systemically, because even that minister was some sort of victim of a systemic issue. I didn't like him, but I can acknowledge the fact that he was living in a context that gave him that position.
It's the God complex. The God complex.
Yeah. You know, it used to really bug me when they tell me I wasn't Jesus Christ. Friends of mine would say, David, you're not Jesus, you know. And I always want to say something clever like, oh, shut up. But there's a complex, I mean, it's heady stuff, you know, to do that. Okay. Who's next here? Okay.
David, how widespread was doubt with your peers? Was that even discussed or allowed to be discussed? And how many out there do you have other peers that felt trapped in that horrendous position too? Could you talk a little bit about that?
I would try to bring it up even in seminary. I'd say, you know, we talk about God answering prayer, but I don't see it happening. And any of the rest of you guys noticing that? And then I'll get quiet. And they would give me the same answer that I would hear before. I just don't let myself think about those things. I think, you're in seminary. You're supposed to be thinking about this stuff. I told you there are about 700 people, if I'm remembering right, in the Clergy Project. Those are the people that have outright said to someone else, I don't believe anymore, I don't buy this stuff anymore, but I can't get out of it. Okay. I also know that I've had a couple of ministers in the last 2 weeks get in touch with me after reading my stuff. And they said, I'm so glad you wrote some of this. And then there's, I feel that way too. And I talked to my friend Kathy Schmidt, who is the UU minister, and I've told her my story, and she says, yeah, I talk to other ministers, and they tell me some of the same things, some of the same doubts. See, if you think critically and you get an understanding of the history of Christianity, or any religion I should think, and you start looking at everything you believe critically, you are going to have some questions. And the only way you can proceed is if you put them aside, make yourself crazy, or are dishonest. I was a mix of a lot of them, but crazy is right up on the top of the list for me. Yeah. Hypocritical? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you use the word cognitive dissonance, which I think makes a lot of sense. I guess what's hardest for me, I didn't grow up in any Christian denomination, and I'm challenged by trying to reconcile values and morals and social justice with what's going on in our society today, particularly political, particularly with immigrants. So I believe that more people in this room are active and trying to make a difference in social justice, and I just can't get it why more Christian churches aren't speaking out.
Aren't following the Christian culture.
I don't get it either. In fact, I've often said, you know, those of you who say you still believe in Jesus, why aren't you speaking up? Why aren't I hearing more at this point? And in fact, why are so many of you supporting people and movements that are so obviously not part of your context? This is not stuff you believe. This is not something you say Jesus taught you. And I don't know, I share your confusion is the best I can say to that. I wish I had an answer. I share your confusion.
I think we can agree, if we, after some deep thought and certainly after a lot of conversations with clergy in and out, that there are things that are more powerful than your theology. There are things that are more
Absolutely.
powerful than your scripture. And those things are personal, and they affected your life in particular. And I
Yes.
think that you were driven not to talk about who you were because of those pressures. So keeping a job and keeping your congregation who is right-leaning happier than the rest of the world getting along well is a hard thing to parse. And most of the time, you're not even thinking about that. You're just thinking about the most important thing in my life is keeping my job and keeping my family.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah.
In all your years of being on the pulpit, did you ever have any parishioners that came to you with doubts of their beliefs? And if so, what did you tell them?
I had a man that was past 90 years old, but still very, very sharp, and taught Sunday school and studied his Bible all the time. And he came into my office one time and he said, Pastor, there are some things that just aren't making any sense. They don't shake down. And I said, you're right.
Wow.
And I said, and I don't have an answer for you.
Wow.
And would you please keep teaching that class? I didn't quite come out to him.
Right.
And I said, I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer that sew it all up for you. And he said, well, just hearing that kind of helps me. I appreciate it. The harder ones were when parents would call me and say, David, my college-age son came home and said he doesn't believe anymore. What do I tell him? Should I show him to other churches? Are there what books should I tell him to read? I thought, yeah, he's going to read it because you told him to. That's good. I said the same thing. I said even when I believed. I said, leave him alone. He gets to decide. You know, you thought you had that all sewn up at confirmation time. You got him baptized, you got him to say the words in front of everybody. You thought you had it all sewn up, but sure enough, they actually had to grow up. And when they did, they said, you know, this ain't necessarily so. And I said, he gets to do that. And I said, the stats tend to show us, and this used to be true, I don't know if it's still the same, but they get a little older, they have kids, they want to do right by their kids, so they start bringing them to church, and then they kind of come back to church, and they don't quite leave it. And I usually said something like that to make Mama feel a little better at the time. I feel that particular question and that particular issue is the one I feel the worst about, to tell you the truth. I felt like I didn't do my job right, and I feel like I failed some people there.
What do you mean by that?
I should have just said, he's right and you're wrong. That's what I
said that once.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting back to the
true.
getting back to the more mundane subject of money.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Have you got some?
A little.
Yeah.
There are certain advantages clergy have in the form of housing allowances and income tax deductions, and there's a case pending in court about that. What's your take on whether they should be allowed to continue with these
benefits? Freebies.
What's the
benefits?
word? Benefits. Or, as an alternative, could heads of other nonprofit organizations claim the same benefits?
I don't know why they couldn't claim the same. I mean, I'm not sure what the reasoning is now about why there would be a distinguishment between them and other churches and other nonprofits. I can tell you that those benefits made a certain amount of sense 50 years ago when my dad was a minister and churches didn't have enough money to really pay a minister a respectable salary. They got a benefit tax-wise. They could have a house. They didn't have cash, but they might have a house, and the minister could live there, and he wouldn't have to pay his income tax. Social Security or self-employment, he would have to pay that. But and that made it a package that made it manageable for the minister to live. Now, in the time since then, ministers have negotiated and they demand more money now. And so, yes, that should be looked at and that should be adjusted to make things fair. It was kind of something to accommodate where preachers were back then, back when I was very little. It is now not the same issue. Although I will say, I told you, I have a Master's of Divinity as a big degree from a private college. A lot of my minister friends have $100 to $200 to $500,000 in college debt to pay off. And so at some point that has to be looked at too as well. Now, you hear about the televangelists and the people that demand money. I will tell you, you know the guy that wrote Purpose Driven Life, Rick Warren? I hate the book. I always hated the book. I hated his first book, The Purpose Driven Church, and I think he's a terrible minister and just not skilled, I mean. And he's not a theologian, he's not skilled in that either. He just was a great marketer, and he marketed the church. I will say that when his book took off and he made $1 billion on the book, he paid his church back every cent they had ever paid him over the last 25 years. And also, he adjusted the housing thing too, to where that's not an issue anymore. And I appreciate, you don't hear that story very often, but that's out there too. You have some ministers with some conscience that understand that it does need to be changed. But you're going to have some poor ministers that are getting poor all the time, and they're going to get taken up short, and that needs to be addressed in some way and adjusted in some way too, I think. And I'm not a minister, and everybody ought to go find some other kind of work, but I already married Sylvia, so they can't have that, they can't do that.
I wonder if Rick Warren wrote that off as a charitable contribution.
Well, if he did, would that be wrong?
Go ahead.
Yeah, someone else?
I'm just curious about the acceptance level that you received from your children, that you all received from your children. And tell you just a little story.
Okay.
I have two wonderful sons who unfortunately have never really been in love with each other. They're very different. And one of them, when in college, became born again. And when I called the other son, I asked him, have you heard from your brother recently? And he said, no. I said, well, you need to know that he's been born again. And then there was silence. And then my son responded by saying, Jesus Christ. Now with every other thing that we have to deal with, two of us, I have to deal with that.
Family's hard, isn't it? And children are hard. And you were asking me about my kids. I'm a little reluctant to tell much about their business. I think they still don't know what to think, and they still don't know how to talk about it with me. And I think there's some strain, but I know that one of them was kind of relieved when I came out to him. It was like I said I was relieved, and I saw him go. But he hasn't quite said what. And in all fairness, he may still be formulating what he thinks, and that's okay with that. And there are some future discussions that I hope will occur in my own situation, and I'm sure it will occur in yours.
Okay, just one more question from Kathy.
You mentioned that you had had an episode of depression.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm thinking, now that you look back upon that, do you think it was really being caused by the inner turmoil of you, even though you weren't yet aware of it, but you were living a dishonest life? You said you had problems, relationship problems with your wife and perhaps others. Do you think it was just this cognitive dissonance, as you called it, bleeding out?
Well, depression as a mental illness is often it's a combination of things. And the specific thing you're asking about, of course, contributed greatly to that. I was also diabetic and did not know it at the time. And it was run away, and you put those two, depression and diabetes, together, you really have a problem. Yes, I will go ahead and tell you, I've been depressed most of my life. And yes, I think the cognitive dissonance has had a problem, has contributed to that. I also think there's a physical thing, a component that should be paid attention to as well. I do wonder if I had been on antidepressants back when I was a teenager, would I have even bothered to have been a minister? You know, would I have? And I say that because sometimes I relate, and there's some danger in this. So there are people who have suffered tremendous abuse and battered by, women battered by husbands. And one of the questions they get asked is not fair. And they get asked, well, why do you stay? And they even give you, I don't know. Well, here's what I learned as a minister. I would say to the person who came to me, I never once said, pray about it and go back. I never once, ever said that, ever. I did learn to say, would you do me a favor? Would you go to your doctor and tell him that your pastor thinks that you're depressed, and could you talk about taking an antidepressant? I take them. I wonder if that wouldn't be of help. And I don't know how many times I've noticed, and I've had other people mention this as well, that a woman who had been abused in her home, when she'd been on antidepressants for about 2 weeks, kind of woke up and said, why am I putting up with this? And started making her plan. And having suffered from the depression, there were things I put up with that I don't now. And I forget why I'm telling you all of that, other than to say, oh, you were, what contributed to it? I don't know. I just know that if I had had something a little earlier, that I might have dealt a little more productively. My life might have been a whole lot more different if I had. That's just me thinking. Thanks, everyone. If I said something... I'm already reviewing what I said. If I said anything that might have hurt your feelings, give me a chance to work that out with you, okay? All right, thanks.